In an $80 trillion global market, only two entities operate as the principal shareholder of virtually everything. It is neither a sovereign state nor the legacy wealth of the Rockefeller dynasty. It is BlackRock and Vanguard. You can switch the channel from Fox to CNN, drink Coca-Cola instead of Pepsi, or opt for vaccines from Pfizer or Moderna. In every scenario, the illusion of competition masks a singular operational truth. The same block of capital managed by the same two investment funds holds the majority ownership of all these brands. We call this the free market. But when the five largest banks in the United States, the world's most profitable defense contractors, and the informational technology giants all report to the same few boardrooms, it is not competition. It is a stealth monopoly. And what they decide about your retirement savings, your consumption, and the next global conflict is something you will never have the chance to vote on. This is the very DNA of who truly holds the world's controlling interest. And understanding why you never hear about it in the media they also control is why we built this broadcast. This is Macro Threshold. Look closely at the financial architecture of Manhattan, the concrete and steel monuments built to commemorate perpetual debt and endless liquidity. What you're witnessing is not just a commercial center. It is the physical manifestation of silent capitalism, an economic infrastructure so vast and centralized that it functions as a global operating system. We are not here to debate political ideology or partisan talking points. We are here to perform an autopsy on the concept of competition itself, revealing the internal wiring, the overlapping ownership maps, and the quiet mechanisms that ensure that the vast majority of human commerce flows through a single narrow choke point. To understand the depth of this control, you must trace its origin back to a promise, the promise of low fees. The story of BlackRock and Vanguard is the paradoxical triumph of simplicity corrupted by scale. It began with Jack Bogle at Vanguard, driven by a philosophy that the ordinary investor was being systematically stripped of their wealth by excessive trading fees. His radical, almost benevolent idea was the index fund, a passive vehicle that simply mirrored the overall market, eliminating the need for expensive, active managers. This concept was the perfect democratizing tool, offering access to market returns cheaply. But while Bogle was refining the model of passive ownership, Larry Fink was building the machine to run it. Fink, the architect of BlackRock, recognized that passive investment required scale, and scale demanded technology. He built Aladdin, asset liability and debt and derivative investment network, a proprietary risk management system that became the central nervous system for managing trillions in assets not just for BlackRock's, but eventually for hundreds of competitors, pension funds, and even sovereign wealth entities. Aladdin centralized the data and the decision framework, creating a single point of intelligence for the global financial ecosystem. The irony is excruciating. The movement toward low fees and accessible investment inadvertently created the single largest concentration of financial power in history. They didn't achieve this by outsmarting the market. They achieved it by becoming the market. This brings us to the era of illusion, the period in which the consumer enjoys the performance of choice, while the capital structure enjoys absolute unity. When you chart the shareholder registries of critical sectors, the map quickly collapses. Consider the giants of defense: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics. Who are the largest institutional shareholders of all four? BlackRock and Vanguard, often holding the top two spots. The outcome of global conflicts dictates their profits, yet the ownership structure is monolithic. The same pattern holds true for information and media. Whether your primary news source is the New York Times, CNN, or Fox Corporation, the controlling capital is identical. This cross-ownership ensures that the corporate narrative remains aligned, regardless of the perceived ideological differences presented on screen. They own the manufacturers of the war machines and the organs that rationalize the necessity of using them. This is not merely diversification. It is structural inoculation against competition and regular intervention. The sheer volume of this shared ownership across GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, means that the dominant engines of global communication, retail, and technological infrastructure answer to the same two primary boardrooms. How do two organizations manage to acquire such comprehensive control without ever truly risking their own proprietary capital? The mechanism lies in the mechanical trap of fiduciary voting power. Index funds and exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, operate by aggregating the assets of millions of individual savers. When you invest your 401k or IRA into an ETF, you're not retaining control over the shares themselves. BlackRock and Vanguard, as the fiduciary managers, assume the right to vote on your behalf at shareholder meetings, the crucial proxy vote. Because they manage portfolios that are designed to hold the entire market long term, their influence is persistent. They are, by definition, the permanent owners. Unlike traditional hedge funds that trade in and out, the passive investor strategy demands they hold their stake indefinitely. This means their accumulated proxy votes, often representing 15% to 20% of the voting stock in the largest companies, become the decisive factor in electing boards, setting executive compensation, and most crucially, dictating corporate strategy. This concentrated voting power allows them to act as a unified, uncontested bloc, overriding the influence of founders, active managers, and even government regule. The ultimate goal of centralized capital is not just financial optimization, but policy enforcement. This transition marks the turning point where finance becomes a global regule tool, bypassing democratic accountability. The prime instrument for this control is the Environmental, Social, and Governance Framework, or ESG. BlackRock and Vanguard leverage their fiduciary voting power to compel corporations globally to adopt ESG metrics. Larry Fink has been explicit about this agenda, stating that capitalism must be guided by purpose and that his firm would demand behavioral change. This is no longer merely a recommendation. It is a mandate backed by the threat of capital withdrawal or hostile proxy votes. If a company does not meet the specified social or governance criteria defined by a handful of unelected asset managers in New York, that company risks being starved of essential index fund investment, a death sentence for any major publicly traded entity. ESG transforms BlackRock and Vanguard from simple financial intermediaries into unelected legislators, shaping global energy policy, labor practices, and even geopolitical alignments, all enforced through the silent pressure of capital allocation. This structural reality leads to the humiliating climax: the vast lack of accountability. Who audits the decisions made in these silent boardrooms? Who regulates the concentration of power that funds both sides of political donations, major media outlets, and defense contractors? The paradox is deeply corrosive. The retirement money saved meticulously by millions of middle-class citizens across the globe is the very capital funding the monopoly structure that dictates the prices they pay, the content they consume, and the economic opportunities available to their children. The true architecture of this power is not visible from the trading floor. It is housed in the quiet digital canyons of automated capital allocation. This is the era of silent capitalism, and understanding it requires looking past the brand names and grasping the underlying mechanism. Welcome to Macro Threshold. We are here not to debate policy, but to expose the pipes of the plumbing. We begin where all great financial revolutions begin, with a seemingly benign idea, the quest for cost efficiency. The genesis of this monumental concentration traces back to the 1970s and the radical vision of Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard. Bogle's concept was profoundly democratic: bypass the expensive, underperforming, actively managed funds and simply track the broad market indices like the S&P 500. This indexing revolution promised lower fees, simplicity, and reliable returns for the common investor, a truly noble intention. He sought to put the capital machine back into the hands of the people, but every revolutionary innovation carries unintended consequences that often eclipse the initial moral intent. The passive revolution, designed to democratize investment, instead created the perfect vehicle for absolute centralization. If Bogle was the moral architect, Larry Fink of BlackRock was the aggressive engineer. Fink recognized that indexing was only half the equation. The other half was technological scale. Through the creation of Aladdin, an immense risk management and trading platform that monitors trillions in assets, not just for BlackRock, but for competitors, pension funds, and even central banks, Fink centralized the knowledge base of global finance. Where Vanguard grew patiently, emphasizing mutual ownership, BlackRock used superior technology and product innovation, specifically exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, to aggressively accumulate assets under management. The irony is excruciating. The democratization of finance through low-fee indexing inadvertently birthed a handful of entities so large, so dominant, that they transcended market competition, morphing into essential global infrastructure. This brings us to the era of illusion, the mapping of the interlocking monopoly. If you own a house, you hold the deed. If BlackRock and Vanguard own a piece of every house, they hold the neighborhood covenant, and they own critical pieces of everything. Examine the shareholder registers of the most critical sectors defining modern life: media, defense, and technology. The animating graphics make the invisible visible. Look at the media landscape. The primary institutional shareholders of Fox, CNN, Comcast, and the New York Times often mirror each other. The entities controlling the flow of information that shapes political discourse and cultural consensus are deeply interlocked at the ownership level, regardless of the perceived ideological differences they peddle on air. Look at the defense sector. The same 2 or 3 asset managers consistently rank as the top institutional owners of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing. They hold stakes in both the manufacturers of the weaponry and the banks that finance the conflict. Global instability is not a risk. It is a profitable structural dynamic sustained by cross-ownership. And finally, the tech monoliths: GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. The concentration of ownership here is perhaps the most chilling, as it dictates the very infrastructure of communication, commerce, and knowledge acquisition for billions globally. This interlocking web ensures that true disruptive competition is highly unlikely, and furthermore, that political lobbying and influence are coordinated, not competitive. They ensure that their interests are articulated with a unified voice to regal bodies globally. But how do these custodians wield power commensurate with ownership when they are simply managing other people's money? This is the mechanical trap of fiduciary voting power. When you buy an index fund, say an S&P 500 ETF, you do not own the underlying stocks directly. The fund owns them. You own a share of the fund. However, the fund manager, BlackRock or Vanguard, retains the crucial fiduciary right to vote the shares held within that index fund at the company S annual shareholder meetings. As index funds grow, they become the largest, most stable, and least likely to sell shareholder block. They are the permanent owners, the perpetual shareholders who do not invest proprietary capital, but who wield the accumulated proxy voting power of millions of passive investors. This proxy power allows BlackRock and Vanguard to dictate board composition, approve executive compensation, and enforce strategic direction across thousands of publicly traded companies, effectively governing the global corporate sphere without facing the risk of a market correction or activist shareholder revolt that might displace true owners. This mechanism is the essential precondition for the turning point, the transformation of capital into a global regulatory tool personified by the rise of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) initiatives. When Larry Fink, in his annual letters, mandates that corporations must demonstrate a societal purpose alongside profit, it is not a suggestion. It is a global policy edict enforced by the withdrawal of index capital. ESG effectively outsources the legislative function away from democratically accountable governments and into the hands of unelected financial technocrats. For a company to defy the ESG framework set forth by the few powerful asset managers in New York is to risk being starved of essential capital, the death sentence previously discussed. ESG ensures compliance not through law, but through the silent pressure of asset allocation, directing energy policy, labor standards, and even supply chain geopolitics across the globe. The humiliating climax returns us to the lack of accountability. When a corporation underperforms, shareholders may seek change. But when the largest shareholders are passive funds, whose mandate is simply to mirror the market, not to maximize individual corporate performance, the traditional mechanisms of corporate governance falter. Who audits the centralized decision-making process of those who dictate the boards of directors for both competing defense contractors? Who regulates the concentration of power that funds political donations across the spectrum while simultaneously owning the critical media outlets that frame the debate? The corrosive paradox persists. The retirement savings of millions tucked safely away in passively managed accounts are the very fuel funding the centralized monopoly structure that dictates the prices they pay for necessities, the content they consume, and the constrained economic horizons available to their children. This global financial oligarchy operates under the protective cover of fiduciary duty, a legal shield against scrutiny. They are too big to fail, too intertwined to regulate, and too passive in their stated mandate to be held accountable for the political and social outcomes their dominance generates. The future of this structure is one of increasing centralization, where the efficiency promised by technology and indexing continues to aggregate power into fewer and fewer hands. The true legacy of this era will be the systemic erosion of competition and the quiet capture of global governance by custodians of capital. Now that you have seen the architecture of silent power, the question must shift. What will you do now that you know who owns the world? The tools for transparency exist, but the will to apply them must come from outside the system they control. Subscribe to Macro Threshold and comment below.